Welcome back to another episode of A Founder's Journey. It's part of the Founder Circle, the Texas Founder Circle, and I just want to welcome my next guest. She is an author. She's a two-time or multi-time founder. She's a pathfinder. She is a patriot, and I'm so excited to have Chicke Fitzgerald with me. Thank you so much, Chicke.
Oh, thank you, Michael. Yeah, it's really a delight. And how many times have I been a founder is an interesting question, because I'm actually on my 13th startup, but I'm on my third where I'm actually writing the checks, myself. So I guess it is number three.
Yeah. Well, that's great. 13 times. Now that's a serious entrepreneur right there. That's great.
Well, it's interesting because I got my start as, and there wasn't even a name for it at the time, an intrapreneur, which meant that I had a paying job. I worked for American Airlines Sabre, and that somebody had a business idea, and anytime that happened, I always got pulled into the room, and they gave me the responsibility of writing the business plan and going to Bob Crandall, who at the time was the CEO of American Airlines, and asking for $5 million. And so I got my first funding from the CEO of American Airlines on behalf of the corporation, AMR Corporation, and started my first tech company from inside the comfort of having a regular paycheck, which, gosh, I wish I had appreciated it then and knowing what I know now.
So how many years ago was that? That's been a while, I'm guessing.
Oh, it was. I want to say it was 1984.
Wow. So you were in the tech world in 84.
Oh, yeah. I actually started in 1978, the same year that the travel industry was actually automated with technology. And American Airlines really led the way with their Sabre product, which had been the airline's reservation system. And they decided, well, hey, why don't we just put this in travel agencies? And at the very same time, in fact, people from United Airlines would argue that they did it first. United had their internal system, which was called Apollo, and they decided to put that in travel agencies. And I actually worked in an Apollo agency in Milwaukee. And so I learned the whole automated front office system, and actually worked as a bookkeeper at the time. So I then was a pioneer on the back office side of automated accounting systems. And that's really where I spent the first few years of my career.
So was it, were you like born entrepreneurial, or is it just more like it just kind of evolved that way?
Well, it's so funny, because if somebody had asked me in high school if I was a risk taker, I would have said no. In fact, if you talk to me, the 16-year-old Chicke, I would have said that I was going to get married and just, be a mom and have kids, right? But as it turned out, I didn't get married until I was 33. I didn't have kids until I was 40. And so here I am in my 60s now on my 13th venture, and I've got kids in college. So I kind of do everything a little bit backwards. But, the short answer to your question is no, I had no idea that I was an entrepreneur until much, much later.
Wow. And then, so you've gone with all these, like 13, but 3 that you were actually cut the checks for. Tell me, as far as that very first one, was that a scary transition? Was it just kind of how did you get to that one?
Well, again, what ended up happening when I was a corporate employee is anytime there was an idea, a blank sheet of paper that needed form and shape, I was always the one called into the room. So there were other people who recognized that innate ability that I had to solve problems, right? That really was the core. And so again, I had a regular paycheck, so it wasn't a big risk at all. In fact, it really felt like a reward, of not having to do the grind of, just a daily job within the organization. So I got to go out to California and actually found a company that I wanted to acquire. And they were developing some software to automate the expense report process. And again, this is 1984. I mean, there weren't even personal computers in people's homes or on desktops. So, really, really out on the bleeding edge. And again, I had to write a business plan, and I was a college dropout, Michael, right? I mean, it's not like I had business school under my belt and knew how to write a business plan. I learned that from the ground up, and then again, had to present it to a pretty discriminating audience, right? The head of the division where I worked was Max Hopper. And I mean, he's legendary. If you just search for him, he wrote an article for Harvard Business Review that talked about using technology as a strategic advantage. And so I learned at the feet of the masters. I mean, no, it wasn't a risk at all. It was just all amazing.
But at some point you walked away, stepped away, there was a change that took place, and there was that first one that there was risk. Tell me about that.
Well, it's really interesting because I left corporate America in 1996. I formed my own company. I did exactly what I had been doing inside of companies. I started doing, time for money. So the traditional consultant, we now call them solopreneurs, right? People who just sell their time. And I did that for a long time, and I got smart about it. I pulled in, a number of people into the ventures I was working on, used them as 1099 contractors. And so the first startup that we did was actually for Carlson Companies. So again, we've got a big multi-billion-dollar corporation that owns Radisson and TGI Fridays. And they had they had a division that was called Gold Bond Stamps. And so they had bought the URL 24k.com, which, by the way, was the most brilliant move of all. A 3-letter URL is absolutely worth its weight in gold now. But we ended up building a platform, a marketplace, if you will, which is interesting since that's what I do now, is we had travel, we had the ability to purchase goods and services, we had entertainment, and we had a loyalty program all woven into that. But again, that wasn't a big risk for me. I was hired on contract. I was working under a bigger contract that Ernst & Young had done with them. And I had a team, and it was about a 1-year project, over $1 million worth of consulting income for me. So again, very little risk on that one, but I was laying the groundwork for what would end up being my core business now. So the first time that I actually stepped out and wrote checks of my own was about 10 years ago. I had been consulting successfully for 10 years and had built, after the Carlson project, had built the first mobile travel portal for Intel, and then built LasVegas.com for 2 of the major casino companies. And again, those were all done under big consulting contracts. Those were my $3 million gigs. And then after September 11th, things changed. So my consulting revenue started, being much smaller. I mean, still really good, $250,000 here, $500,000 there. But at the end of the day, I was doing something that I was really good at, but it gave me no joy. And that's why I started my first company. And I started by getting a team of people to work with me on sweat equity, and found out that I'm really good at that, right? I'm a little bit like the Pied Piper who walks through the village and, gets everybody to follow them. And so I had a really amazing team. We wrote a patent application for what we were going to be building. We found a company to build it for us. I raised a total of $7 million. $6 million of it was from a local investor here in Tampa, and I put $1 million of my own resources into that business. So that was the first time I was actually writing checks. And while that sounds really easy, I mean, I didn't have $1 million in the bank, right? Like most entrepreneurs, it's borrowing from your 401k, cashing out this asset, selling your Rolex, mortgaging your house, and all those things that are actually really painful decisions, especially when you've got a spouse who is not an entrepreneur.
Yeah. Yep. And I'm sure any entrepreneur out there knows that feeling too, who's married.
Well, I call it, when you move from being a solopreneur into being an entrepreneur is when you start paying MasterCard with Visa, right? When you've got to find a way to make it happen, and anything is fair game at that point. And again, I did end up raising money on that business, but not before I put a significant amount of my own time and energy and my own money into it. And unfortunately, it didn't end well, right? And again, that's a story better told over a very large bottle of wine. But at the end of the day, I stepped back a little bit too early from that venture, hired an executive team that didn't have any entrepreneurial experience. It's like I was making every textbook move that you can make that leads to business failure. And anyway, ended up having to shut that company down right before the economic crash. Talk about bad timing, right? 2008, 2009. And, there was nobody to sell the business to, even though we had built an incredible platform. We had launched it on Travelocity. All the things that we did should have been home runs. But again, there were just enough things going on that, that just weren't the right formula. And I learned that later. And, failure is a great teacher.
And so that's great. So speaking of teaching, what was your biggest takeaway from that setback?
All money is not good money is number one. And again, the gentleman who invested in us, he was a really great guy. He's still a friend. And we've done other ventures together, even though we both lost everything in that venture. But it was not the money he put in, it was the way he put it in. He actually funded the company a week at a time, which meant that every single week, my leadership team had to ask Daddy for more money. Okay. And anybody who's had to go ask anybody for money, whether it's an allowance or, whatever it is, that is a very uncomfortable position to be in, because you're constantly having to justify instead of operating strategically, like the team should have been able to do. So I think that was a big learning exercise. And then also the fact that I hired a team that had really great credentials, but they had never worked in entrepreneurial ventures, which meant that they were used to having a team of people to go off and do their bidding, right? And when you're an entrepreneur, you have to be willing to say, sales, this is Chicke. Oh, you'd like to talk to service? Service, this is Mary Ellen, right? And, you're constantly putting on different hats and having to do everything in the business.
Yeah, that makes sense. So no, good money's good money, and then make sure you get the right people, because obviously that same team, year or two later, maybe, or three, whatever it was, it could have been successful if they were a little farther on, right? It was just the wrong team at the wrong time. Is that right?
Well, again, they were good people. I hired people with amazing credentials, but when you have not had to do everything yourself and you're used to having even an assistant to book your travel, right? It's just a real rude awakening to have to do everything. And so, yeah, wrong team, wrong time. I think getting people who have worked together before and people who have actually built something from scratch, those are really important criteria.
Yeah. So, okay, so that got you. That one went away. And all of a sudden now it's the recession, Great Recession.
Right.
What's happened next here?
Well, I did a lot of soul searching about what I wanted to do. And, I knew I was built to solve problems, right? So you have to really look deep inside at what you were made to do. And I liken it to having a suitcase that was packed for you, right? God packed my bag before the foundation of the earth, right? And he knows every hair on my head. And in that suitcase is everything I need, right? But so many people don't even open that suitcase and see what's inside, right? And so I looked back on my life. I looked back on my career, right? Why did I have that skill set, right? Why did I learn how to do all the things I learned how to do when I was in corporate life, right? And what was I now meant to do with those same things, right? And how can I apply having joy in everything that I do? And one of the other things I wanted to do is I wanted to be able to give back in a really meaningful way. So let's say that you're a corporate executive or you're a successful entrepreneur, pulling down $250,000 a year in a salary. Well, if you believe in tithing, right, then you would be giving 10% of that. Well, I knew I was capable of doing that, but I knew I was capable of so much more. And if I could build a $500 million business, and if the company could give 10% off of that $500 million, wow, what could I do then? I could change lives. I could change generations. I could change communities. We could eradicate, big problems. Right. And that's where my heart was. So I wanted to build a company that made a difference. So really that purpose-driven piece wasn't present for that first venture.
Gotcha. It's interesting because a lot of people that could have they could have could have crushed them, right? And said, hey, I'm no longer, I'm done. I'm going back to corporate America, whatever it is, right? But instead you dug deep. You dug deep and you found your why. Right. And you said, hey, this is it.
Well, and at the same time, I also went back to what I was good at, right? I went back, I did some consulting. I got an enormous project with AARP, and that allowed me to get back on my feet. I mean, we actually had to declare bankruptcy after that first venture. It wasn't just that it didn't go well. I mean, we lost everything and had to rebuild that from scratch. And my husband had worked for me. So, I mean, it was a double whammy because we didn't have a second income to draw on. Now, this time has been different. So after I went through that process of trying to figure out what I should do, I had started my radio show. So 15 years ago, I had started interviewing authors. That show is now called The Game Changer. And so I still had that, but it had never been something that I monetized, right? So I monetized my consulting, but I didn't want to go back to that, right? No matter how good I was, that wasn't where my heart was. So during my first venture, I had built a little piece of technology. I think I told you the story the last time we spoke. My niece had had a super serious accident, had been airlifted to Montana. None of us lived in Montana, so we all had to get there. My two older sisters were gonna, get there their own way, and so I had to fly in. And they said, well, since you're from the travel industry, you get the hotel room. And it was then and there that I realized how difficult it is to find a hotel nearby something else. Now, you would think, oh, hey, Chicke, Google Maps solves that. Well, it actually doesn't. It takes between 9 and 12 keystrokes to find a hotel nearby something like a hospital, right? And when you're in shock and just wanting to get there, for the surgery or, whatever it is that is drawing you to that venue, you just want to get there, right? And you want a good place, you want something close by. So I came home from that trip and I built the hotels nearby hospitals. And that's the core of our current product, which the brand name that we market under is Traveling to Give, which again weaves in that thing in my heart of really wanting to give back in everything that we do. And then the product finds the hotel nearby wherever you're going, whether it's an event or whether it is a specific place like a hospital.
Wow. So, when did you start that one then? How long ago was that then? What was that one?
Well, again, it always it is an issue of when you start counting, right? So we started building the platform 4 years ago. I built the first prototype though 10 years ago. and, kind of tucked away the idea for a while. It just wasn't the right time. But we got really serious about it 4 years ago. And then again, we took it really slow because of that experience I had with losing everything and going through bankruptcy. I didn't raise big money this time. I really self-founded it for a long time. Again, lots of sweat equity. I've got 35,000 hours of my team's time in this venture. Which, if you do the math, that is somewhere between $2 and $3 million that I didn't have to raise because we did it that way.
Yeah. Wow. And so, what are your the book? We didn't even talk about the book, but maybe wait for the end. Let's because I was going to ask you what the book you recommend. So let's play your book. How's that? So okay, so your biggest takeaway after going through all this process.
Mm-hmm.
And somebody starting out, what would you tell them? What would be the biggest, best advice you would give somebody who is like, oh, I want to do this?
Well, there are a couple of lessons along the way. Again, when I decided to write my book, it was because I had read a book in the same genre, which is the business parable, right? An allegorical novel. And the book that I had read was Bob Burg's book. He wrote it with John David Mann, and it's called The Go-Giver. And that book changed my whole life in that it planted that seed that I wanted to write something like that. And what I ended up doing, and it took me to actually write the book, it was like a weekend. I started it on a Friday and I was done by Monday. But then it took another 6 or 8 months to go through and do all of the editing that happens to actually get a publisher to pick it up. But the book allowed me to write about my hopes and my dreams and my fears. And all of those things got wrapped into a fictional novel, right? But I wrote it in Forrest Gump style, which was really, really fun because I could weave in politicians and sports stars and entertainers and people in real life like Max Hopper. He is a character in my book. And also a bunch of the authors I had interviewed on my radio show were characters in the book because people listened to my radio show as a part of the book. So it was just great fun to write it. Now, I didn't write it to sell a whole bunch of them. I mean, it is still available on Amazon. But, when you write a book, you have to decide what it is that you want to do, right? I wanted a business card. I wanted a book that said The Game Changer because I wanted to be known as the game changer, right? I wanted my technology to be looked at as game-changing technology, right? And my radio show, right? Why would somebody not want to be on a show called The Game Changer? Right? Because then they get to take that moniker with them. So, I think if you decide to write a book or to do a podcast, you have to have a very, very specific reason for doing it. And if it is to make a bunch of money, you really need to then go back to the drawing board because that's really, really hard, right? It's doable, but it's not normally what it produces. It produces this amazing world that lives around those things, but those aren't generally the things that drive money.
Well, the interesting thing about books is authors it's almost like getting a doctorate, right? You write a book and you're all of a sudden you have a doctorate. It's literally the way, right? It's just the immediate expertise and something. So tell us, I mean, what would be the takeaway for somebody who on the book? What was the why? If I was you would tell me as a reader of the book. What would be the best thing that they would get from that book?
Well, the story of the book is really about staying the course, right? That if you really feel passionate about what you're doing, stay the course and find people who will surround you that encourage you to stay the course. To me, that's more important than money being invested in the business. And finding people who will have your back, watch out for you, people who will pray with you, right? Because it isn't all a fun journey. It's not, starting your own business is not for the faint of heart, and writing a book is not either. But on the book, and you mentioned something about, it's like getting a doctorate at the end. My very first book was all about my industry, and it was called E-commerce Pioneers, because the companies that I worked for in those early days really were e-commerce pioneers. E-commerce existed back in the late 70s in the travel industry, because you could buy and sell global travel product, in 1978. And when I wrote that book, Michael, when I was finished with it, and, as an author, you read and reread your chapters dozens of times, if not hundreds of times. But when I had the printed book in my hand and I read it start to finish, I couldn't believe what I knew, right? That I wrote all of this, right? And that my base of knowledge was worthwhile. So I think, particularly for those who are solopreneurs and consultants and coaches, if you have a base of knowledge, writing a book about that, whether anybody ever buys it or not, is immaterial. Once you've written it, and, again, self-publishing is pretty easy these days, but once people see that you're a published author, then you can easily claim being the expert in that field. And that's what I did in global travel distribution. And so pretty soon I went from making $800 a day as a consultant to, at my top, I was making $7,000 a day for my time, right? Because I was one of the only people who was expert in that field, right? So it can really change your trajectory if you are a solopreneur. And again, it can give you the confidence with an investor. I mean, I wrote my book so that I could put that on an investor's desk and say, here's why you should invest in my company. It's because of what I've lived and what I know.
Wow. Well, I think that's phenomenal advice. I love it. I love it. So I really appreciate you coming on and visit with me again, Chicke, today. And I just wanted to, maybe if somebody wants a little more about you, more your business, how can you get over you, learn more business, what would they do?
Well, my favorite place to send them is simply to ChickeFitzgerald.com, and it's CHICKE Fitzgerald.com. And I've got my portfolio there, which is actually, it's built using the tool, which is part of my Solutionz smart tool set. And so they'll be able to see all about me, where they can go to learn more. I'm working on another marketplace project called My Patriot Marketplace, where we've got almost 1,000 stores of made in the USA products, and have been putting together an incredible community there. So you can learn about all of that simply by going to ChickeFitzgerald.com.
Perfect. Well, thank you again so much. And I'm sure people will get a lot out of this today. Thank you.
Okay, Michael, thank you so much.